Unit 1, Lesson 2 is called Roots of Democracy. And in this lesson, we'll be taking a look at where some of our ideas came from in shaping our current system of government. And we're going to find that a lot of those ideas actually reflect our English heritage. So we borrow a lot of ideas from England. One of the ideas that we borrow from England is a system of common law, which is where laws are based on the rulings that happened in previous cases. And so in England's earliest years, they actually didn't have a system of written laws. What they would do is if a case came up in court, the judge would look back and see if something similar had already come up in court. And if it had, they would use that ruling to make their decisions moving forward. So over time, a more complex system comes about where people understand, well, if someone breaks a contract, this is usually who is found guilty and what the punishment is, and that's what they do for anyone in the future moving forward. Some other ideas that come out of English documents, one idea was that rulers must follow laws as well. That comes out of the Magna Carta. We'll talk about that more in class. Also the fact that citizens have basic rights that no one should be able to take away. We also like the idea of sending delegates to actually represent the citizens at meetings rather than having just one person in charge calling the shots or trying to include everyone, which we've already discussed at why that would kind of be difficult or impossible to do. So these are just some of the ideas that we borrowed from English government. Some of our other ideas about government were shaped during the colonial period. You might remember last year learning about our experience as the 13 colonies of Great Britain, us perhaps not being too happy about being those colonies. Regardless, we do take a lot of the ideas from that time period and we've incorporated them into our current system of government. One example was one of the first legislatures in America, and that was the House of Burgesses. And that was seen in Jamestown. You might recall learning about Jamestown. And so this was an example of having representatives go and make the laws for a certain area. So a legislature is a lawmaking body. By body, we just mean people. It's the group of people making the laws. Another really important document that we borrowed from in shaping our current government was the Mayflower Compact. This was an agreement that was drawn up and signed by the people on the Mayflower as they were coming to America. And this established a tradition of direct democracy. So that idea that everybody participates. Everybody on the ship participated and agreed in the creation of this document. So they agreed on how their colony would be governed before they even left the boat. Now, English colonial governments had some things in common. For one, they all had a governor and they all had a legislature. And so we've actually adapted that to our state governments today. So that is something else that we've kept. And as we know, as time went on, there was a growing need to separate from English rule. Many of the colonists were unhappy by being ruled by a government that was very far away from them, could not really understand their needs, and frankly seemed to be taking advantage. So there is the whole concept of taxation without representation. So the colonists weren't able to represent themselves, self-govern, and this resulted in the American Revolution, which resulted in independence. And again, hopefully that's all a review from your lessons last year. Now, upon winning independence and setting up our first government, the early state constitutions, or the plans that we drew up for each state, were very similar to the ones that already existed in the colonies. So they had a legislature, they had a governor, and they had their own court system. But now that we were a new nation, we wanted to create a document that would be for everybody to follow. And that first plan of government, that first constitution, was called the Articles of Confederation. And as you might have learned last year, the Articles of Confederation weren't all that successful. It actually led to a very weak and decentralized nation. So again, we are talking about our very first document that told us how our government would be organized. That's my picture of a document. So some of the problems that we had under this plan was that, one, it was very hard to pass laws. So if they wanted to pass a law for the whole country, 9 out of the 13 states would have to agree, which is a lot. That's more than the majority. it was also very difficult to change the plan of government if they decided there needed to be an improvement. You would actually have to have all 13 states agree to a change. Also, it was very difficult to enforce the laws. There was no real power that Congress had to enforce the laws that they were able to pass. And Congress couldn't also collect taxes. So that kind of sounds like a good thing, yay, no taxes, but it became a problem when Congress needed to raise a military. They needed to have an army to squash Shays' Rebellion, you might remember learning about that, and they simply did not have the money to support a military. That's a huge problem. So for all these reasons and more, it was decided that we needed to go back to the drawing board with our plan of government. So some important terms that I threw around in that last section there, one of them is confederation, and that means it's a group of individuals who band together for a common purpose. So in this case, we are referring to the 13 states that are joining together saying, hey, we're a new country and we are independent, but we're still very individual and different, and we're going to have a lot of rights on our own. So that's, kind of the status of our country in its earliest years. The other word that was important to know is amend, which means to change or improve. And of course, here we were talking about how difficult it was to amend the articles. Later on, we will use the words to describe changing our Constitution. So that is it for this lesson. This was a much shorter lesson than the rest will probably be. But what I want you to do is make sure that as you took notes, you were understanding all the key points that I was discussing. And if there were any things that you thought were confusing and maybe you would like to go over in class, please make note of it. All right, you can write it on a Post-it and stick it right to your notes, or you can write your question directly in the notes. Just be prepared to come to class and say, Mrs. Schwerin, I didn't understand this. Can we please go over it? And then I will see you guys in our next class.